The rain was coming sideways off the harbor when my whole life changed, and I remember thinking, that was exactly the kind of thing that only happens in Nova Scotia in November. I was walking to my car after a 12-hour shift at the community health center, my scrubs still damp from a spill in room 4, a bag of leftover muffins from the staff room tucked under my arm. The parking lot smelled like wet asphalt and diesel from the bus terminal across the street. I had a podcast queued up for the drive home, and leftover lentil soup on the stove. And that was the full extent of my plans for the evening. My phone buzzed in my jacket pocket, unknown number, Nova Scotia area code, one I didn't recognize. I almost let it ring out. I was tired in that particular way that settles into your bones after a long shift, and I'd already gotten 2 robocalls that week about my car's extended warranty. Which was funny, because my car was a 2009 Civic with rust along the wheel wells that no warranty on earth would touch. But something made me stop at the edge of the parking lot, rain tapping against my hood, and answer. A man's voice, measured, careful. The kind of voice that has delivered difficult news before and learned to do it gently. He asked if he was speaking with the granddaughter of Edgar and Ida McAllister. I told him yes. He told me there had been an accident on Highway 104, outside Antigonish. A transport truck crossing the center line. My grandfather and grandmother had been driving home from the Legion Hall, where my grandfather had played cribbage every other Friday for 30 years. He told me they hadn't suffered. He told me he was very sorry. I stood in the rain for a long time after the call ended. A seagull was picking at something near the dumpsters. A city bus went past and threw a sheet of water across the curb. I don't remember getting into my car. I don't remember the drive home. I remember sitting on my kitchen floor, still in my jacket, still holding the muffins, and not being able to find a single place inside myself to put the feeling. Before I tell you what happened after that, I need to tell you who my grandparents were. Not the version of them that existed in my parents' telling. Small, backwards people from the wrong kind of place, but who they actually were, because nothing that came next makes any sense without it. I grew up in Bedford, just outside Halifax, in a house with a 2-car garage and a flagstone front walk, and parents who cared enormously about what the neighbors thought. My father ran a property management company and drove a Range Rover he leased new every 3 years. My mother sat on the board of 2 local charities and organized the Community Association's annual garden party, and had very particular opinions about what kind of people belonged in certain neighborhoods, and what kind didn't. My brother, 4 years older than me, was exactly the son my parents had always wanted. He did his undergrad at Dalhousie, his MBA at Queen's, moved to Toronto before he was 30. He worked for a private equity firm, flew to Calgary twice a month, and knew how to fill a room in a way that made our father proud just by walking into it. I was quieter. I liked books and rainstorms, and the way the light looks over the Northumberland Strait at 6 in the morning. I asked too many questions at the dinner table about things my parents considered impolite subjects. I wanted to be a nurse from the time I was 12, and said so without apology, which my mother received the way she received most things I told her about myself. With a slow exhale and a look of patient disappointment. The only place I ever felt like I could breathe properly was my grandparents' house in Pictou County. My grandfather, Edgar McAllister, had built McAllister Freight Solutions from nothing. Literally from nothing. 1 truck, a route from Truro to Moncton and back that he drove himself, sleeping in the cab at rest stops to save money on motels, eating peanut butter sandwiches, because he'd promised my grandmother the money for a new water heater, and he wasn't the kind of man who broke promises. He had a grade 9 education and more integrity than anyone I have met in my life, before or since. Their house was small and a little tilted, and smelled like spruce wood and molasses cookies. My grandmother, Ida, had a vegetable garden along the back fence. In summer she'd send me out with a basket, and I'd come back with my hands smelling like garden soil and leaves. And she'd put on the kettle, and we'd work side by side in her kitchen, like the afternoon had nowhere else it needed to be. My grandfather had a workshop in the shed where he'd let me hand him tools, and explain what each one was for. Patient, precise, never talking down. He had a way of explaining things that I've tried to carry into every room I've ever worked in. My father was embarrassed by them. He called their community outback of nowhere, though it wasn't. He made quiet, cutting remarks at holiday dinners about my grandfather's truck in the driveway, or my grandmother's coupons, sorted in a rubber-banded stack on the counter. He never said directly what he meant. He didn't need to. The message was consistent. These people were beneath us. Never mind that they had quietly contributed to the down payment on my parents' first house. Never mind that my grandfather had co-signed for my father's commercial property loan in the late 90s. A loan my father had been rolling over and never quite repaying. Never mind that every time the property management company hit a rough stretch, my grandparents had filled the gap without being asked, and without ever mentioning it again afterward. They had given freely and been diminished for it. When I told my parents I wanted to go into nursing, my father set his glass down on the table. "We're not paying for that." My mother said there were other options, more sensible directions. What she meant was directions that looked better from the outside. My grandparents paid for nursing school without hesitation. My grandmother mailed me a card the week orientation started. She wrote in her crooked, looping cursive, "The world needs people who show up when things are hardest. You have always been that person. We are so proud." I kept that card in my nursing bag for 7 years. I still have it. I became a registered nurse at a community health center in Halifax's North End. My apartment was small. My car had seen better decades. I stretched my paychecks carefully each month, and I loved my life. My patients were everything. On the hard days, I'd remind myself of what my grandfather had once said when I'd asked him why he still came into the office every morning when the company could run itself. Because the people who depend on you don't stop needing you just because you're tired. Love. My parents called occasionally, usually to mention something my brother had accomplished, or to remind me that someone in the extended family was getting married, and I needed to find something appropriate to wear. They never asked about my patients. They never asked about my work. Every Wednesday after my shift, I drove to Pictou County. 2 hours each way on a good day, longer in winter. I never once considered not going. We'd have dinner, and my grandmother would tell me about the garden, and my grandfather would be working on something in the shed, and would come in with grease on his hands, and tell me a joke that was terrible, and I'd laugh anyway. And we'd watch whatever game show they had on at 8, and I'd drive home with a container of leftovers, and enough warmth stored up to carry me to the following week. 7 years. Not one Wednesday missed unless I was genuinely ill. The funeral was the most polished, performative, hollow thing I've attended in my life. My mother wore a coat she'd bought specifically for the occasion. My father gave a eulogy that sounded more like a corporate tribute than a remembrance of the man I knew. My brother stood in the receiving line and accepted condolences with a practiced solemnity that had nothing behind it. Extended family, who hadn't set foot in Pictou County in years, filled the hall, murmuring about what wonderful people Edgar and Ida had been, which might have been more moving if any of them had visited in the last decade. I stood near the back and cried, and nobody noticed. 2 weeks later, we were summoned to the offices of a lawyer named Alistair Dewar. His office was on Prince Street in Truro, 3rd floor, with a window that looked out over the Salmon River. Everything in it was composed and still. My father sat in his chair like a man who had already mentally redesigned the room. My mother's hands were folded in her lap, nails painted a deep burgundy. My brother kept glancing at his phone until Alistair Dewar gave him a look that made him set it face down on his knee. Alistair read through the standard language. I barely heard any of it. I was looking at a small photograph on his shelf. A lighthouse, somewhere, winter light on ice, and trying not to fall apart entirely. Then he said, "The entirety of the estate, including all shares of McAllister Freight Solutions, the property at 14 Ridgewood Lane in Pictou County, and all registered and non-registered accounts, including RRSPs and TFSAs, valued at an estimated $22 million, is bequeathed in full to one person." The room shifted. To the granddaughter of Edgar and Ida McAllister, sole beneficiary. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I have ever heard. My father's face moved through several stages in about 4 seconds. Confusion, disbelief, something colder underneath both. "Read that again," he said, and his voice was very, very controlled. Alistair did not read it again. He slid the document across the desk. My mother's composure cracked. "This is absurd," she said. They were elderly. She was over there every week filling their heads with. "They anticipated questions regarding their capacity," Alistair said calmly. "They prepared accordingly." He turned his laptop to face the room. "They left a message." My grandparents appeared on the screen. They were sitting on their couch, the one with the faded blue plaid pattern that I had sat on 1,000 times. My grandfather had his hand over my grandmother's. They looked older than the last time I'd seen them in person, but their eyes were absolutely clear. My grandfather spoke first. "Well, if you're seeing this, we've left a bit of a mess by going, and I'm sorry about that. Your grandmother picked out what we were wearing, so at least we went out respectable." My grandmother elbowed him gently, smiling. Even then, she made me laugh through tears. "We made this decision together," she said, looking into the camera. "With clear heads and full hearts, over several years. We thought a long time about what legacy actually means. We decided it doesn't mean money. It means who carries what you built, and whether they understand why you built it." My grandfather cleared his throat. "To our son and daughter-in-law, we love you. You are our family, and that doesn't change. But there is a difference between love and trust, and we learned that difference over many years. We watched how you treated people who couldn't give you anything in return. We heard the things you said about where we came from. We saw what mattered to you. We saw what didn't. My grandmother looked straight into the lens. And we saw our granddaughter. She drove 2 hours every Wednesday, every week, for 7 years. She sat with us. She never asked for a single thing. She laughed at your grandfather's terrible cribbage jokes, and helped me put up the fence posts, and called just to hear our voices. She is the one who carries this family's heart. So she will carry what we built. The screen went dark. I will not describe in detail what happened in that room, in the minutes after the recording ended, except to say it was not brief. And it was not quiet. And my grandmother would have been deeply unimpressed by all of it. They summoned me to my parents' house that evening. I went, because some part of me still believed there might be something salvageable. There wasn't. My father had paperwork drawn up. A transfer of administrative authority. They would manage the estate. I would receive what he called a meaningful share. 15%. You're a community health nurse, my mother said, in the tone she used for things she considered self-evident. You cannot run a freight company with 47 employees and a national contract portfolio. This is the responsible arrangement. This is us protecting you. I looked at the papers on the coffee table. I thought about my grandmother's voice on that screen. She is the one who carries this family's heart. No, I said. My brother paced the length of the room. My father told me I was naive and selfish in the same sentence, which I didn't think was logically possible, but he managed it. My mother cried in a way that had nothing to do with grief. Then my father told me he'd been meaning to mention something. The building where I rented my apartment on Agricola Street was held through a numbered company. 1087432 Nova Scotia Limited. He was the sole director. He had always been the sole director. In 7 years I had never known. He told me he would be exercising his right as landlord to issue a formal notice to vacate. That he hoped I understood residential tenancy law applied to both of us, but that the process would begin immediately, and that if I walked out of that house without signing the papers on the coffee table, that was the last conversation we would have. I would be done. No calls, no holidays, nothing. I looked at my mother. She looked at the window. I picked up my bag and walked out. I drove back to the apartment and packed what mattered. My nursing bag. My books. The letters my grandparents had sent over the years, rubber banded by year in a shoebox. The quilt my grandmother had made when I graduated from nursing school. Pieced together from scraps of her house dresses. My grandfather's old flannel shirts. And a square cut from the kitchen curtains at 14 Ridgewood Lane, where we had eaten 1,000 Wednesday dinners together. As I was carrying the last box downstairs, my father was in the hallway. He told me I had always been difficult, that I had never understood how the world actually worked, that I had no idea what I was walking away from. I said nothing. I got in my car. I drove to Pictou County. The porch light at 14 Ridgewood Lane was on. I don't know why that undid me more than anything else had. It was just a light. But my grandmother had always left it on when someone was expected, and someone had turned it on anyway, and I sat in the driveway for a long moment before I could get out of the car. Alistair Dewar was there the next morning, with 2 cups of coffee and a bag of Timbits, because he was a man who understood that some things require both caffeine and something small and round, and manageable, to hold in your hand. He'd tried my phone through the night, he said, when I didn't answer. He figured I'd gone where I belonged. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and told me what my grandparents had spent the last 4 years quietly building. A folder. Then another. My grandmother's journals. Precise, dated, handwritten in the same crooked cursive she'd used to tell me she was proud of me, documenting every loan extended to my father that had never come back. The one in 1998. The refinancing in 2006. A commercial line of credit my grandfather had co-signed in 2019 that my father had been hiding from his own business partners. A total of just over $190,000 in documented, outstanding debt to the estate. Then Alistair opened his laptop. 3 days after the funeral, my mother and my brother had let themselves into the house, using the spare key that hung in my parents' mudroom. On camera, my mother went directly up the stairs to the hallway and reached behind the framed map of Cape Breton on the wall. She removed a small fireproof lockbox mounted behind it. She took out my grandmother's pearl earrings, the garnet brooch my grandmother had worn to every Christmas dinner I could remember, a gold locket that had belonged to her own mother, passed down through 4 generations of women in that family. My brother stood downstairs with his arms crossed, watching the front window. My grandparents had installed the security system 6 months before they died. They had known. They had thought of everything. Medical certificates confirming their full cognitive capacity, signed by 2 independent physicians within the year prior to their deaths. Statutory declarations from their pastor, their doctor of 30 years, and 3 long-term neighbors. Alistair had filed copies with the Nova Scotia probate court before the will reading. The estate was ironclad. They had built a fortress and handed me the keys. Over the following days, they came, the people my grandparents had trusted, who had been quietly standing by. Dorothy, my grandmother's closest friend of 41 years, who arrived with an additional journal, and 2 pans of blueberry buckle, and hugged me like she intended to leave an impression. Hugo, my grandfather's leadspecher for 2 decades, who told me calmly that he'd overheard my brother on the phone once, a few years back, talking about the company as though it were already his to inherit. Fern, the company's accountant for 15 years, who spread the financial records across the kitchen table with a quiet fury that was more unsettling than shouting. And Judge Elaine Forsyth, retired, whose family had farmed 3 townships over, and who had known my grandparents since my grandfather was driving that first truck, who showed up in a blazer with a travel mug and said, simply, "Edgar called in more favors in this county than any man I've known. Let me return one." When my father, mother, and brother arrived the following morning, expecting to find me alone, expecting to find me small and undefended, they found that kitchen table full of people. They found a retired judge. They found a former RCMP officer, who had been my grandfather's neighbor for 22 years. They found an accountant with 15 years of financial records spread in neat, deliberate order across the surface. My father tried his usual approach. He pointed at me and used the word manipulative. He called it a circus. He began to speak to Alistair in the tone he used with people he considered to be working for him, rather than against him. Alistair let him finish. Then he turned the laptop around and pressed play. They watched themselves on the security footage. My mother went absolutely still. My brother's jaw tightened. He looked at the floor and kept looking at it. Fern placed the loan documentation on the coffee table beside the laptop, without comment or ceremony. The room was quiet. The kind of quiet that settles when everyone in it knows the argument is already over. The stolen jewelry was returned within a week. Alistair handled it directly, and there was no courtroom drama about it. Just the cold clarity of footage that made alternatives inadvisable. My grandmother's pearl earrings, the garnet brooch, the locket, all of it came back. The outstanding $190,000 in documented loans was applied against any future claims on the estate, of which there would be none. It was handled without shouting. There didn't need to be any. I looked at my father before they left. I had spent a long time in my life, trying to find the version of him that made sense, the one who might eventually see me the way he saw my brother, who might one day ask about my patience or my work, or whether I was happy. I had spent years auditioning for an audience that had made up its mind long before I walked on stage. "You didn't come here to protect me," I said. "You came because they chose me, and you couldn't make that untrue. No matter how many papers you put on a coffee table, they watched all of us for their entire lives. They saw what you valued. They saw how you treated people who couldn't give you anything in return, and they made a decision. I think somewhere, underneath everything, you know exactly why they made it. I think that's the part that's actually hurting you, not the money." My father had no answer. My mother was crying. It was the first time I'd ever seen it and not been entirely sure it was performance. They left. The door closed behind them. The room exhaled slowly, like a held breath finally released. The months that followed were full in a way I hadn't anticipated. Alistair guided me through the probate process with patience. No small thing in Nova Scotia, where an estate of that complexity requires careful and deliberate navigation. Fern walked me through the company's financial structure until I understood it properly. Hugo taught me the operations side, the dispatch systems, driver routes, maintenance schedules, fleet logistics. Not because I was going to run it day to day. He was more than capable and had been for years. But because my grandfather had always believed that a leader who doesn't understand the work cannot genuinely respect the people doing it. I learned what it cost a long-haul driver to spend 10 nights away from his family. I learned why my grandfather kept coffee on in his office at all hours, and why every driver in the fleet called him by his first name. I found a folder in the filing cabinet in the back office, something my grandparents had been quietly drafting together for 2 years. The bones of a foundation. The Edgar and Ida McAllister Community Fund. Their vision was specific and unpretentious. Bursaries for first-generation university students from rural Nova Scotia. School supply grants for underfunded classrooms across Pictou and Antigonish counties. A dedicated award for students entering the health professions from small communities who couldn't otherwise afford the path. I put $6 million into it in the first year. I kept nursing. I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters more than anything else. I kept showing up every morning to a shift that needed me, to patients who were having the worst days of their lives, and who needed someone to look them in the eye without flinching. The inheritance changed what I could do for the people around me. It did not change why I was there. When a patient mentioned quietly that she couldn't fill a prescription this week, I could do something about that. When a colleague on our outreach team had been covering school supplies out of her own pocket, every September for 6 years running, I could change that. The money wasn't mine to keep. It was mine to move in the right directions. I live at 14 Ridgewood Lane now. The house still smells like spruce and molasses cookies. Or, maybe that's just what I carry in my memory every time I walk through the door. I genuinely can't tell anymore where the real smell ends and the remembered one begins. My grandmother's vegetable garden is along the back fence, and I tend it badly but consistently, which I think she'd forgive. My grandfather's tools are on the pegboard in the shed, arranged by size, and I have not moved a single one. On Wednesday evenings, the kitchen table is full. Dorothy, Hugo and his wife, Fern, who has excellent opinions on most things, including soup, Alistair, who has become something close to what I imagine an uncle might feel like, present, steady, quietly funny, colleagues from the health center, neighbors, a shifting, imperfect, overlapping collection of people who loved the same two people I loved, and who keep showing up for each other now that those two people are gone. These evenings are nothing like the dinners I grew up with. Nobody is performing. Nobody is keeping a running score of who said what and whether it reflected well on the family. We talk too loud and laugh at things that probably don't deserve as much laughter as they get. And we argue about hockey in the completely irrational way that people who care about hockey argue about it, and we eat until there's nothing left and then somehow find something else anyway. My grandfather would have loved every minute of it. This is what they left me. Not $22 million. They left me proof that a life lived with integrity compounds over time. Every fair deal my grandfather made, every driver he treated with dignity, every neighbor he helped without being asked, every promise he kept when no one was watching, all of it came back. Not to him. He never needed it to come back to him. It came back to me, in the form of a kitchen full of people who had loved him and who were willing to stand up and say so when saying so cost something. They left me the understanding that real wealth is not what you accumulate. It is what you build in the people around you. It is the nursing student from a small town in Antigonish County who gets to finish her degree because someone she never met decided she was worth that investment. It is the child who arrives at school on a January morning and finds that the classroom has what it needs and doesn't run out. It is Wednesday dinners where nobody has to earn their place at the table, and the porch light is always on. If you've ever been the invisible one, the one who sat at the family table without ever quite being included in it, I want you to know this. The people who truly see you are real and they exist. They are often not where you expect to find them. They are sometimes the ones the rest of the world walks straight past, without stopping. And sometimes the people who were supposed to love you show you exactly who they are, with perfect clarity. And the most powerful thing you can do is believe them. And stop asking them to be something different, and go find the people who leave the porch light on for you. If any part of this story stayed with you, leave me a comment. Tell me about someone who saw you when others looked right through you. I read every single one. And if you're not subscribed yet, I'm glad you're here, and there's more to come.